Hello, I'm Stephen Taylor. I am one of the moderators who works with CIPD on their assessments, also one of the people who helps set the assignment questions for some of the level 7 modules. Next slide, please. So this webinar is going to be very much focused on 7C002, People Management and Development Strategies for Performance. And I'm going to give you some general guidance on assignment writing at level 7, and then we will look at the specific questions that we have set for 2024 to 2025, and I'll give you a little bit of advice, some background, some thinking on how to approach each of those. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to start with general guidance, and really what I want to do here is explain what level 7 assignment writing involves, how it's different perhaps from level 5, level 3, M level, the level that you're now studying at. Next slide, please. Okay, so 7002 is one of the core units, not an elective. It's one that everybody has to tackle. And it's one of the two, 7001 being the other, where we have assignment-based, essay-based assessment. It's all set by CIPD, so everybody's doing the same thing all around the world now, certainly all around the country. And the way it works is that we have 16 questions that we set each year, one linked to each of the 16 assessment criteria that are set out in the CIPD syllabus. There are 4 learning outcomes, and each of the 4 learning outcomes has 4 assessment criteria, making 16 in total. And while we expect you to prepare and study in respect of all 16, you're only actually going to be assessed on 4 of the assessment criteria in each window. So you'll be writing an assignment based on 4, and your tutors will let you know ahead of time which of the 4 questions, which of the 4 of the 16 will be the ones that you're going to be answering in your assessment window. That's the way it operates. You complete all the learning, you prepare effectively all 16 questions, but you only work up 4 into a full answer. And each of those 4 will be a different learning outcome. Next slide, please. Okay, so the way it works is that you will do 4 little essays, around 1,000 words each. We do have a little bit of leeway on precise words for each of the 4 questions. The total needs to be 4,000 words plus or minus 10%, so you can go up to 4,400 across the 4, and that does exclude references. We do need to see references, but you can exclude those from your final word count. And what we're really looking for is both depth of understanding and breadth of understanding in respect of each of the learning outcomes and therefore each of the assessment criteria. And the important thing really is that we're looking for you to develop an argument. Level 7, it's not just about summarizing your reading. It's not just about demonstrating knowledge and understanding. It's about doing something with that knowledge and understanding. So we want you to explain what your view is, set out an argument, an original argument, and then draw on your reading to justify your argument. So it's an exercise really in you saying, this is what I think, this is why, and you're going to use examples, you're going to use statistics, you're going to use published research findings. You may well draw on your own experience in order to justify the argument that you're putting forward. But we do need to see evidence of wider reading. We do need you to cite your sources, and we want those to be credible and authoritative sources. We want you to take the process very seriously. Don't rush it. Do plenty of reading in preparation. Think about what you've read. Decide what your view is of the big debates in the world of HR and people management and the contemporary ones, and then develop your arguments thoughtfully and justify them as effectively and as persuasively as you can. That is really the key to doing well in these assignments. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to finish off this little section, what are we looking for at level 7? What are the key criteria? Well, we need to see that you are becoming a confident, independent learner. So you're not simply reading stuff which your tutor has recommended, but you're going out and you're finding your own material. You're going onto databases, you're looking as widely as you can for your own information, your own sources of information. And we want you then to demonstrate that you can write about topics in a completely confident manner, intellectually confident manner. Develop an argument, justify that argument. Sometimes people ask about writing style. This is less important. We're not interested particularly in this style. You may write in quite an academic way, you may write in a very non-academic way. Doesn't matter so much, but what we are looking for is some good referencing, and we are looking for what we would describe as a professional style of writing, a professional standard of writing. What would be expected of a manager, an HR manager, a people manager, working at a reasonably senior level in an organization. So it's important that your writing style is professional. Next slide, please. Okay, so having talked in general terms about what we're looking for, I'm now going to talk about each of the 16 specific questions that have been set for 7C002 for 2024 to 2025. I'll go through each of them in turn. Um, Please don't just listen to the one that's about the one you're doing, because there will be guidance for all of them, which will be of general relevance as well. Okay, let's move on to next slide. Okay, so the first one, you'll see from each of these slides that we've got the assessment criteria there. So the first assessment criteria is explain the major objectives of people management practice in contemporary organizations. And the question that we're asking in relation to this one this year reads as follows. In recent times, people management specialists have sought to distance themselves from administrative activity, repositioning our function as one focused on strategic activity, which adds value. To what extent do you agree with the view that this is a mistake? Justify your answer. Well, this is an interesting one, and one that's relevant to a lot of people. You may well have very strong views on this. You may well have some experience of this issue. Um, the question really is, does administrative activity add value? Is administrative activity bureaucratic, um, cost oriented, not really helping an organization to fulfill its strategic objectives? Or should we conceive of it a little bit differently from that? And a lot, of course, depends on the nature of the administrative activity. A lot of administrative activity is just done for the sake of it, it seems to me. We're not very good at being lean on the administrative side, and not all of it at all adds any value whatsoever from an organization's point of view. But that's not true of all administrative activity, because some administrative activity which we do in the people management HR field is necessary. It's vital. It's important. It's issuing contracts. It's dealing with the administration relating to new starters and people leaving an organization. It's maintaining records that might be necessary, absence records, running payrolls, training records, holiday records, things of this kind, which need to be done. And it's always been my view that that necessary administrative activity, well, if it has to be done and you can do it more efficiently and more effectively than your competitors, well, then you are adding value because you're doing necessary, unavoidable administrative activity in a really good and effective and efficient way. So you need to work out what you think, draw on your own experience. Should the HR function, the people management function in an organization distance itself from admin? Should that be delegated, outsourced, or should it be something that's embraced and seen as being integral to the function's credibility as well as its capacity to add value for an organization? So you decide what you think and then justify your answer. Use examples, make it as sophisticated and as thoughtful and as persuasive an answer as you're able to do. Next slide, please. Okay, number 2, so moving on now to the second assessment criteria, which is all about alignment, what's known as vertical integration, to the extent to which what happens in the people management field aligns with, specifically directly aligns with the business strategy of the organization, so that one is looking to assist the other in achieving organizational objectives. The idea of the people management function is to support the achievement of current strategic objectives by the organization. And we're really wanting you first to say whether that's true in your organization, and secondly, to recommend some change that might make it better. And obviously, that's going to vary hugely. So we'll just go through the question. Evaluate your own organization's capacity to align people management practices with overall business strategy. In what ways do people management practices directly support the achievement of organizational objectives? And then recommend one change which might help achieve better vertical integration. Now, of course, organizations vary hugely in terms of how well aligned their HR policies and practices are to business strategy. In some organizations, it's very clear. In others, it's less clear. In fact, it may not really happen, certainly in a conscious way. And so where your organization is obviously going to determine the evaluation that you develop in the first part. I'd say again, don't just state this is where my organization is. We're good at this, we're not good at that. Give examples, illustrate, justify the argument that you're putting forward. And then recommend a change. Anything that you think might be helpful. Probably best there to start with an analysis of the business strategy. What are your organization's current business objectives, core, central, strategic objectives? And then recommend a change which will help in the people management field better achieve those objectives or one of those objectives. So it's actually a fairly straightforward question. Some of the terminology can be a little bit confusing. The word vertical integration, for example, is a quite technical term, but it really simply means you're integrating your people management objectives with your business objectives. Next slide, please. Okay, you are asked to make a presentation to the senior management team in your organization, which examines resource-based approaches to the development of people management strategy. Explain the underpinning theory and provide one recommendation about how it might help improve your organization's long-term success. What key points would you make justify your answer? Now, often we ask these questions where we say, you're making a presentation, what would be the key points you'd make, and so on. And when we do ask those sort of questions, it's obviously important when answering to be aware of your audience. And those are going to vary depending on the type of question. So here we're talking about your own senior management team. And that's likely to be people who are not so familiar with the idea of the resource-based approach, may not even have heard of it. And so we need to start with some general points introducing what this is. Now, resource-based view always seems to me to be a little bit vague. I kind of understand it. I've always understood it in theory, but what exactly it means in practice is not always so obvious. So it's important when doing this to both explain what it is, define it, but also give some very appropriate examples to illustrate, probably examples from your own organization to illustrate what we're talking about. So resource-based view, resource-based thinking essentially means that we stop worrying about the external environment when determining our strategy, our HR strategy, our people management strategy, but instead we start with an analysis of our existing internal resources. And that may be individual people and the strengths and weaknesses of those people. It may be the culture of an organization. It may be a reputation an organization has as an employer. Anything where you are distinct and strong in comparison with your competitors, your labor market competitors. And then you build on those strengths. That's the idea behind it. It's very compelling in theory, but in practice, it may not be so straightforward. So your role really here with this question is to give it meaning. Use your own organization, draw on your own experience to color in the lines on resource-based approaches. Take the theory and give it some meaning with some practical examples, which is what a senior management team would expect to see if you were briefing them in this way. Next slide, please. Okay, number 4, critically evaluate evidence to demonstrate that the introduction of high performance work practices in the field of people management will lead to sustained organizational success across all industrial sectors. Justify your answer with reference to leading published studies. Well, the term high performance work practices is one term that's sometimes used. High involvement practices are sometimes used, sophisticated practices, progressive practices. They have subtly different meanings, but essentially we're talking here about the idea that is a bundle of best practices. There's a bundle of really good, effective ways of doing people management. And if you put them all together, irrespective of your business strategy, irrespective of the country you're operating in, irrespective of the industry, whether you're a small, large, medium-sized organization, irrelevant. All of those variables are irrelevant. There is a single, well-recognized bundle of practices, often called high-performance work practices, which, when introduced, lead to sustained business success over a long period of time. Now, that is something that has been very, very widely researched over the last 30 years. You will have no problems at all finding very compelling, very interesting research evidence on this question. It's very persuasive on the surface. It looks like we can very clearly show that there is a link between business success as measured by a whole manner of different financial measures, but not always, because in the public sector, it's not necessarily about finance, but it's about positive outcomes. Well, whatever you use, whatever method you use to measure business success, does seem that there is a link between that and the more sophisticated approaches to people management. And that is what you would expect logically to be the case. You have in place good, strong HR policies and practices. That's going to help you attract and retain the best people. It's going to help you motivate and engage those best people. It's going to make you better at managing change. It's going to make people more inclined to be proud of the place they work and therefore more inclined to demonstrate discretionary effort. And that will then all feed through to collective improved performance, individual performance combined, leading to better business performance. Um, the trouble is that the research doesn't absolutely demonstrate that. It suggests that, but it is persuasive, but it's not uncontested because there are other possible explanations as to why we have a link. And it may be a reverse situation. Maybe an organization becomes very successful for other reasons and then has surplus income and decides that it's going to become an employer of choice and invests in its HR, its people management practices. It may be that way round. And there are other critiques that you can read about which are suspicious, I would say, about some of the claims that are made about high performance work practices. One way or another, this is what's called best practice thinking. It's removing the idea that HR should vary depending on the business strategy, the nature of the organization, saying there's a single recipe for success. And that's a really, really interesting question, really interesting debate in this whole field. So we want really to know what your view is on it. Are you satisfied with the evidence? Do you find it compelling? And justify your answer. And again, draw on statistics, draw on research findings, draw on your own experience, draw on organizational examples to justify the answer, the argument that you're putting forward. Next slide, please. Question number 5. Assess established approaches to succession planning, considering whether they are elitist in character, inappropriate for use by organizations with a commitment to equality, diversity, and inclusion. How can they be reformed to make them more inclusive? Justify your answer. Okay, so obviously here we need to start with an understanding of what succession planning is trying to achieve and how it is traditionally carried out. So succession planning is very much focused on the more senior jobs in an organization, and making sure that at any time you have people who are able to succeed into those core crucial senior roles if necessary. So if the current occupant drops down dead or the current occupant leaves without much warning, not time to train up a successor and so on, is there someone in place who could succeed immediately if necessary? And then below that, you have a number of people who are moving into those kind of positions. Talent pipeline is sometimes an expression used here. So you identify people who are possible future senior managers, and then you develop their careers accordingly. And this is really interesting and important area of people management work, but it has traditionally tended to be done in quite a subtle and informal way. Existing senior managers spot potential future talent, people who they think might be really useful and helpful in the future. And it's done in quite a private manner, quite a hidden manner, and individuals are selected in that way. And that may work practically, but it is a little bit exclusive. It's a little bit elitist in its approach, and it's not necessarily at all commensurate with a commitment, which organizations often also make, to equality, diversity, and inclusion. I think on equality and diversity, it needn't be a problem if the people who are selected are appropriate and um, come from a variety of different backgrounds and so on. Inclusion is the one where there's an issue. Because remember, inclusion is about taking steps to make sure that everybody perceives they have the same opportunities as everybody else. And that's the problem with traditional succession planning. It doesn't feel inclusive if you're not one of the people who's been selected. And this question really is asking you to debate that issue, but also to say how you can reform succession planning in order to make the systems more inclusive. So we're thinking here about openness, having application systems which people can apply to be on, fast tracks and so on, rather than it being done by existing senior managers, kind of selecting the people who they think, who are likely, of course, to be like them in the way that these things operate naturally. So there is an issue here. Can we be committed to EDI and also effective in our succession planning? And we need to make sure that's true. As always, you need to justify your answer. And for one like this, examples are always a very good way of justifying your answer. Next slide, please. So question number 6. With reference to your organization's record in the field of employee retention, evaluate current developments in employee retention. Put forward 2 distinct recommendations for measures that might reduce levels of unwanted employee turnover in your organization and justify your choice. So we're here very much focusing on employee turnover, employee retention in your own organization. Uh, the first task is to give some sort of broad evaluation of the state of play in your organization. And of course, this may vary depending on the groups you're talking about. It's perfectly possible as an organization, well, indeed, typically will compete in a number of different labor markets, some of which will be tight, some of which will be loose, some of which it's harder work to recruit and retain people, others where it's much more straightforward. So in answering the first one, consider the different types of labour market that you're operating in. And remember, you're not just describing, you are evaluating. It'd be so easy with a question like this, just to describe what's happening. We want you to explain why it's happening. And then come forward with some recommendations. Again, these can be in any kind of field. We are looking here at the future, so don't just describe what's going on currently. We want you to come up with new recommendations and things that will reduce unwanted employee turnover. Make them credible, make them affordable. It's very easy to come up with a highly sophisticated, very costly plan, but something that is reasonable, is credible. Um, use references, use examples, use statistics when answering a question like this to justify the key points that you're making. We have the next slide, please. So question number 7, moving on here to HRD, learning and development. Evaluate the development of asynchronous e-learning, considering whether this will dominate the practice of delivering training in organization or settings in the future, making classroom-based approaches rare. Justify your answer with reference to published research. Well, there's an enormous amount of research on this whole development. Very rapidly, particularly since the pandemic, we have moved away from classroom-based type approaches to training within organizations. It's tended to move online, and it's often delivered asynchronously, a bit like the video you're looking at now. This presentation I'm giving is an example of asynchronous e-learning in itself. That I'm recording this, and you will be listening to it, watching it, maybe multiple times at a future date. Now, the question really is that going to dominate in the future? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the approach? And that inevitably there are strengths and weaknesses associated with all of these type of things. Asynchronous e-learning is very efficient. It's allows the possibility for perhaps more sophisticated approaches to the training um, using modern contemporary technologies. But is it as effective really as classroom-based approaches where you have human interaction, you build up relationships, you can ask questions whenever you like, including privately to the tutor. You build up networks of people who are also doing the same training as you, you learn from each other, tacit knowledge as well as formal knowledge. There are big debates about this whole question. So is it going to continue like it is at the moment, more and more of this type of thing? Or are we going to see some sort of a backlash against it? Will we end up with a blend? You decide what you want to argue. There's plenty of research, masses of published research on this, which you can use to determine what your view is and justify your arguments. Next slide, please. So moving on to employment relations. Evaluate the view of the critics of promoting employee engagement, who see it simply as another in a long line of people management practices which intensify work, benefit employers more than employees, and generally lead to stress and burnout over a period of time. Justify your answer. So we're here talking about what do we mean by employee engagement? We're here talking really about employee engagement, but that's defined in different ways. So probably with this one, you do need to start by setting out your idea, your view of what we mean by employee engagement. And the critics tend to see it as they often do with a lot of HR people management interventions, as nice and fluffy, attractive, sounds nice, sounds employee focused, but actually underlying the rhetoric is a reality of just getting people to work harder without paying them much more money. Um, now, with employee engagement, you can argue that that's different and that it's not like that, but it could be seen to be like that, and that it puts people under a huge amount of stress, and over time they burn out because the work has become too intense. A lot will depend on what type of intervention we are talking about when defining employee engagement. So you need to start with that and then think about, well, who benefits, who doesn't. A lot of the research on employee engagement differentiates it from stress and burnout. Specifically, it's a form of employee engagement for going the extra mile, discretionary effort, and so on, which doesn't lead to stress and burnout because it's people choosing to do it because they want to, not because they have to. It's a nice idea, but do employers and employees benefit equally or not? Use examples. Again, plenty of research on this debate, and justify the arguments that you make. You can argue whatever you want. You can argue yes or no, but make it a thoughtful argument and a well justified and credible argument. Next slide, please. So now moving on to some questions about the organization of people management in organizations. And the first one is the extent to which it is either practical or desirable to outsource people management activities to commercial external providers is very limited. It's a quote. Examine this point of view with reference to your reading and your own experience or observations. So here we have a quote which is quite stridently expressed, basically saying, keep it in house. Do HR, do people management internally, limit your use of external providers because it tends to disappoint in practice. Now, we need to talk about two separate things here. One is the wholesale outsourcing of people management activities to private providers. Now, that was very fashionable 10, 15, 20 years ago, and there was a lot of literature written in that period about that this was going to be the future and so on. Be careful not to rely too much on that rather dated literature. It hasn't aged too well. A lot of organizations did experiment with outsourcing HR and found it problematic. So there's that side of it, and that should be something to include in this answer. But of course, it also happens in much smaller ways and probably more effectively in smaller ways. So little chunks of people management activity outsourced, training, payroll, recruitment, employment law advice, things of that kind. So you don't handle them internally. You have access to external experts who will assist you in those different things, either by doing some of the work or by advising you. Now that's where it becomes much more valuable potentially, done in that micro way rather than the big macro way. Either way, make your argument, say whether you agree or disagree, or how far or how little you agree or disagree with this statement. Justify your answer. Give use, uh, refer to your reading, refer to references, refer to your own experience. Lots of examples in order to justify the argument that you're putting forward. Next question, please. So question number 10. Another one about a presentation, but this time it's to a local CIPD branch. Okay, so again, remember your audience when thinking about these questions. You're asked to make a short presentation at a local CIPD branch meeting about how people managers can best carry out an audit focusing on how ethical the practices within their function are. Critically assess the nature of ethics and professionalism in people practice to underpin the key points that you make. So there are two parts to this really. One is a general critical assessment of ethics and professionalism in people practice, people management practice. And the other one is something more specific about an audit in the function itself. So bear in mind you've got those 2 points to cover. We're only asking here for the key points. It's not going to be a very long presentation. It says short, so I think maybe 15, 20 minutes. In that time, you can only make 3 or 4 key points. So what would those key points be, and how would you justify those? I would say that you should think broadly. There are many different ways you can audit anything, including ethics within organizations. Some form of survey instrument or focus group is helpful. There may be metrics that you can draw on. You may be able to develop an audit tool, so like a questionnaire, which specifically focuses on this, which you can then use to benchmark your own organization. Think about the different ways you can audit things in the people management field. And then the second part, much more reflective, it's on people management. There's lots of room for originality here, lots of room for you to draw on some theory. Um, what does constitute ethics and professions? A broad area in people practice. And again, you can only make a few points. Think broadly, focus in your view, what is ethical, what is professional in the way that a people management function is organized. I would think of some key principles and then justify those. That would be the way I would tackle this one. Next question, please. So question 11. Examine the major ways in which technology is changing the people management function in organizations. How far do you agree that the advent of generative artificial intelligence will bring about much more change in the future? So again, we have a two-part question here. The first one is a general reflection on how tech is used in the people management function, how it's changing things. Again, things are changing so rapidly in this field. It's best probably to be very contemporary in the way that you approach this. So don't think about how it has changed the people management function in the past, but the way it's currently doing so. And you will have all kinds of examples from your own experience to draw on there. But again, there's plenty written about this, all kinds of examples that you can draw on. The second part is much more specific and is about generative artificial intelligence, which is this new technology, really. We've only had the last year or two, which is exploding, rapidly changing so much all around us. It's going to be transformative in the future. It's going to have the potential for making us far more productive, and therefore it's going to bring about a lot of change. The question really is how much, because there is a view that it's not a panacea, that we're perhaps over talking its significance. It's hugely helpful, but it's artificial intelligence. It's not accurate. It's not perfect by any means. It's not hugely reliable. There's a view that we should think of it in terms of 10, 70, 20. 10 being setting up the prompts in the first place, getting the AI to do what you want it to do. 70, that 70% of the work is then done by the AI. And then a further 20% of the time is you going through what the AI has produced. Now, that might be contracts, it may be policies, it may be briefing papers, whatever it may be, anything that AI can do really quickly. But you need to spend quite a lot of time going through it, using your expertise to check that the AI is correct. So, yes, it's going to bring about a lot of change in the future, but it's probably not a panacea. It's not going to change everything fundamentally. It doesn't replace human expertise, but it does constitute a massive productivity enhancer for someone with expertise to use to do their job much more quickly, much more efficiently. Either way, whatever your view is, set it out, justify your answer. Next slide, please. So question number 12, critically assess the use of online questionnaire surveys as a method of establishing how effectively people management is being carried out in organizations and how satisfied staff are in their roles. What are the major potential advantages and disadvantages of the approach? Justify your answer. Well, there are different ways in which these online questionnaire surveys are badged. They are given different titles. Staff attitude survey is the traditional way of describing them. They are efficient. They are always interesting. If they're confidential and people are being honest, you can pick up a lot of insight into taking the temperature of staff morale and so on in your organization. But there are disadvantages. One is that they often have very low response rates. Um, because they're online, they're delivered by email and so on. People don't always notice them, don't always prioritize them. You have to give plenty of reminders to get people to do them. So you may get a very limited number of responses and therefore of limited use. Uh, there is, however, advantage with them. Uh, you can benchmark against other organizations, particularly if they're using the similar surveys. You can certainly track your own progress over time. You can compare this year with last year and the year before. You can compare different departments. You can compare different business units. It has those advantages. Um, Lack of qualitative feedback is sometimes an issue. They are very quantitative. They don't give the um, responder much chance to say why they've argued what they have. So again, they are limited, but are nonetheless useful. So much depends on how they are deployed, the rhetoric around them, the communication around them. And there is a question then on the impact of employees. If you ignore what is said in if you ignore the outcome of a staff attitude survey, you're going to annoy people. So it can have a negative impact in those circumstances. You really have to design the survey very carefully and then make sure that you act on any findings that are very strong, very clear from the survey. Either way, what you need to do here is set out your view, draw on your own experience if you can, look at the literature on staff attitude surveys and similar types of exercise, and then justify the arguments that you're making with reference to those things. Can we have the next slide? Okay, question 13. You're asked to make a 15-minute presentation to your senior management team, which analyzes how your organization may partner formally with major customers or customer groups to evaluate and improve the performance of the people who you employ. What major points would you make? Justify your answer. So again, you need to bear in mind your audience here, the senior management team of your organization. You may already be partnering in a formal sense with customers in order to evaluate and improve people management performance. You may have user groups if you have big major corporate customers. You may do focus groups with customers. You may have surveys that you ask your customers to complete. You may have mystery shopper type arrangements, all kinds of ways that you can do this. It's quite important. It's not written about so much. You won't find so much published research on this. But either way, explain what you're doing at the moment. How could it be improved? What would you argue? And again, justify the arguments that you're going to make. So moving on to question 14. You work for a public sector organization. A senior manager from a large commercial private sector organization has been hired to undertake an important project-based people management role. You are asked to prepare a short training session as part of their induction, which examines the major ways in which people management in your organization varies from that typically found in larger private sector organizations. What key points would you make? Justify your answer. So essentially, we're here asking you to think again about key points. It's a short training session. You can only make a few points, 3 or 4 points. What would those 3 or 4 points be, and how would you justify those? Now, public sector and private sector people management does vary in every country of the world. You can choose whichever type of public sector organization you want to base your answer in. You might want to talk about local government, central government, healthcare, education. You choose the sector and then discuss how that is different, how people management tends to be different in those organizations than it is in the typical larger private sector corporation. It will vary from country to country. So whichever country you're in, you will find the answer that you will want to me will be different because there are bigger differences in some countries between public and private sector work than in other countries. Either way, it's important to justify your argument. So pick a few things. Why is it different? It's not just saying it is different, but why is it different? Okay? What are the reasons for the differences? There are major cultural differences. I've worked in the private sector, I've worked in the public sector, I've worked in third sector as well. And they are totally different in the way that they approach people management. The values are different, the underpinning philosophies are different. It's really a question of picking a few of the key points, distinct ones, don't just repeat yourself, and then justifying the points that you're going to make. Next slide, please. So question 15, talking here about international HRM. Drawing on examples and published research, assess why the effective management of expatriate staff can be challenging and often leads to disappointing outcomes in practice. What one major recommendation would you make to an organization that was about to expatriate a senior manager to work in an overseas subsidiary for the first time? Justify your answer. Well, again, this is a very well researched area. You will have no difficulty at all accessing high quality research on the whole question of how to manage expatriates well. Why does it often go wrong? Sometimes the expression expatriate failure is used. That's probably pushing it a bit far because it's putting a lot of load on the word failure. They do sometimes fail in that people simply can't adjust to living overseas and come back early, or they perform really badly in the role, or their families simply can't settle when they are expatriated along with the principal person. They can be really disastrous and very costly for organizations. But more often they are completed, they just disappoint in practice. They don't achieve what you want them to achieve. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. Can be to do with poor selection, can be to do with poor support, poor preparation. Often the problems come at repatriation, come at the end. People have a fantastic time, they love being overseas, and then they come back home, and that's where you get the problem. You get the resignations, the disappointing performance. So look at the research on this, explain the general issue, and then make a single recommendation. Think through what you think, having read about this subject, perhaps drawing on your own experience at all, what recommendation you would make. And as always, we need you to justify that, but we also need it to be a credible, practical recommendation, not something highly expensive and sophisticated, but something that would be plausible for most organizations. And question 16. So we come to the last question. Now, in the new CIPD syllabus for 7002, the final learning outcome, the final assessment criteria, really relates to current issues and current research, things that are developing currently in the people management field. So we're going to have very different range of questions, often based on recent CIPD research, published research. So for this year, we're looking at menopause, really topical issue, something that's coming to the fore in all kinds of ways in the employment law field as much as in the practical management field. So we want you here to draw on the recent survey by CIPD and analyze your own organization's record of supporting women who are going through menopause. And in this case, 3 distinct recommendations. Now, again, make sure they're distinct from each other. It's not just one recommendation expressed in 3 different ways. You're not going to have a lot of space to go into considerable detail, so a few recommendations. You'll find plenty of commentary on this issue presently. It is very current, very topical, very interesting. And you will be able, I think, to put forward some questions. Evaluate your own organization's current position in this, and that will be very varied depending on which organization you work in. The important thing, of course, is to justify your recommendations. I think with questions like this, there's a great danger that things are justified purely in terms of good practice without thinking about the business case. There should be an underlying business case to justify, particularly something that's going to be expensive or maybe contested, maybe controversial. So think through the business case, not just we should do this because it's the right thing to do. We should do this because it's the right thing to do, and there's a business case that backs it up too. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this webinar. I hope you found it useful. I also hope that you will find writing your assignment itself to be a useful learning experience. The whole process of researching and writing should enhance your professional knowledge, your professional understanding, should be part of your learning. And I would like to hope you might approach it in that way. Thank you very much.